I want to pivot before we run out of time here to the issue of voting rights, which is what you've been championing most strongly so far. I know you were down the street at the protest earlier this week on Wednesday for voting rights reform. I want you to remind everybody where we are with that and what you see as the real obstacle and who you see as the real obstacle to actually getting these voting rights bills passed.
Well, look, I've been arrested outside the White House now, I think 4 times in the last couple of months. There have been a lot of protests up on Capitol Hill about the need to pass voting rights legislation. I'm supportive of it. But there becomes a point when only the president of the United States can actually get the job done. Mm-hmm. We saw it on the infrastructure bill, and we're there with voting rights. These voting rights bills have to be passed by the end of the year, or we will see a massive onslaught of racially tinged, hyper-partisan redistricting, just like we did in 2010. And what that means is that the president of the United States has to call on the Senate to clear a path for an up or down vote on the voting rights bills for which we have a majority. Kamala Harris, I want to be clear, has done her job. She's got 51 senators, and that's not an easy thing to do as president of the Senate when 2 of them are Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. But she's done that. Now Joe Biden has to do his job, and so our protests have been calling on the
Joe Biden's job being
his job is to call on the Senate to clear a path for an up or down vote. That means to either fix or nix the filibuster. Get the filibuster out of the way so we can have an up or down vote. It is absolutely a Jim Crow filibuster. And President Biden has said good things, but he has to walk that talk. Martin Luther King III was with us getting arrested 2 protests ago.
He's been on this podcast.
Yeah. Oh, he's a sweet guy, good guy, very clear thinking guy. And like his dad, a bit soft spoken, when it's one-on-one. And Martin said, reminded people that his father, when the 64 Voting Rights Act was passed, went to President Johnson and said, great, now let's pass the Voting Rights Act. President Johnson said, I agree that we need it, but I have nothing left. I can't help you. And when Martin Luther King Jr. walked out, as his son recalled the other day at this protest, said, well, we're just going to have to make him do it. So we're in the just make Joe do it mode.
Okay, and here's the thing. We're talking about LBJ facing, I don't think that LBJ was saying, oh, I have the votes and I just don't want to get rid of the filibuster.
Nope.
He's saying there's a political reality that has to change such that the pressure, it's clear to everyone that the consequences of not doing this thing are worse than the consequences of doing it. And so I have the political cover to do the thing you want me to do. Right now, that's not the issue. You're telling me that you have 51 votes to actually pass this thing. And Joe Biden, through sheer obstinacy or I don't know what, is deciding this isn't just about passing a bill. This is about voting rights legislation that could be the last possible saving grace for a Democratic Party that is failing miserably electorally across the country. So it's to his own benefit and to his own party's benefit to pass this legislation. And for some reason, we're in the posture of begging him to save his own neck.
You're absolutely right that it's good politics for Joe. It's not just good policy, but it's actually the basic American principle. And yes, we're demanding it, which is what the civil rights movement does. We have seen him move, not quite far enough, but it's about 80% of the way.
What's the movement?
August, CNN town hall, he was like, you just can't stop people from voting. By 2 weeks ago at CNN town hall, he said, we may have to create a carve out in the filibuster or reform the filibuster in order to get the vote that we need. That's very good. Now we're going to keep the pressure on him because we only got, 6 weeks or something before the end of the year. And these bills got to get passed now.
So what do you understand? Because to convince someone's mind, to change someone's mind, I imagine you'd have to have some understanding or at least some prediction of what's going on inside, what's motivating them. Given that it's not just good policy, it's good politics for Joe Biden. Given that what do you think is motivating his reluctance to do this very obvious thing that he should do? He has described it as the Jim Crow, filibuster is a Jim Crow relic.
Yes. So I would say one is just the distraction of being president, right? Everybody's clamoring for everything. Now, this is a democracy and voting rights kind of central. So then the second thing I would say is, I think like a lot of politicians, he wants to be the second coming of FDR, right? FDR is still the most popular president.
He's not doing a very good job.
And no, I mean, we can get into that. You ever want to have me back after this, last round around? But no, and so FDR, what is he known for? Dealing effectively with entanglements overseas while rebuilding the American economy. And that seems to be Joe's comfort zone. When he's actually called to be like the best version of LBJ, which is he did those two things, and he passed voting rights and civil rights and dealt with it. So he has to deal with all three. Joe has to, frankly, deal with all three. Well, the reason why LBJ, who I think also wanted to be like FDR, was forced to deal with all three was that the movement wouldn't let him do anything but. And so we have to lean in. That's why I'm so appreciative of all the groups that are keeping pressure on the president right now. We have People for the American Way, the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, Black Women's Roundtable, like all, Color of Change, Stand Up America, like just all these groups, Indivisible, Our Revolution. I have to, absolutely keep the pressure on.
Do you think there's a role for threatening to withhold one's vote from Democrats if they continue to pussyfoot around the way that Joe Biden is doing, not just around voting rights reform, but his reneging on his promise to pass George Floyd Act reforms by the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, canceling student debt, any number of promises that he's reneged on. It seems like if even millions of people in the street last summer couldn't get him to fulfill many of his campaign promises, at what point do you think these stakes have to be ratcheted up by activists who are protesting and have signs and are pressuring him, but it doesn't seem to be having an effect?
I think it's the wrong use of privilege to simply say what you won't do. I think you got to use all your privilege and actually decide what you're going to do. And
well, I'm going to vote for a third party candidate,
or I'm going to primary, right? Or I'm going to support somebody who's going to primary.
Right.
So, that's what I would say. I can never encourage anybody not to vote. What I would say is if you don't like, do what I did. Like, I looked at who was running for governor here in Maryland, and I decided to throw my hat in because I couldn't find anybody I was excited about, and I started off in fourth place, and in the primary, I ended up in first by a lot. But, a lot of people laughed when I ran. They were like, what is this kind of like, talking head on TV, Negro Bernie bro dude running for governor of our state? What? And so that's what I would say is like Briahna or any of the other kind of, young activists, like run, and find somebody to back to run, push Cori Bush to run, whatever.
Well,
AOC, whoever anybody wants. It's better to have someone to vote for than to simply not.
So you think that one of the progressives should primary Joe Biden if he doesn't follow through on his campaign promises?
That's why we have a primary.
What do you think would be their fate?
I don't know. I mean, I got to tell you, in my primary here, I had two county executives of two of the very largest counties in Maryland. And it was just the only question in the media was which one of them was going to, be the Democratic nominee. I was in fourth as a civil rights activist. I ended up in first by a lot. So you just got to go do it. You just got to go do it. It was not a rational decision, Briahna, when I ran for governor. Any political expert would have told you I was on a fool's errand. Setting aside that we were up against anybody was going to be up against an incumbent, Andrew and Stacy, two old friends and people who I'd organized with when we were young, were up for open seats. We were up against the second most popular incumbent here in the country, and we knew that was going to be tough. But getting through the primary was the first thing, and it was considered a fool's errand. And again, it just what it affirms for me is that nobody really knows who should run until they're running. And then even then, it takes a long time before you get traction. And one of the things we do at People for the American Way with our Frontline Leaders Academy is we train young people to run. And then once they're in office with our Young Elected Officials Network that Andrew Gillum created here 17 years ago, Stacey Abrams went through that program. Pete Buttigieg went through that program. Julian Castro went through that program.
Is not.
But what I'm saying is all these people started off as like activists and people that folks weren't actually thinking as a young Black woman, as a young Chicano man, as a young gay white man, think 20 years ago, were like shoo-ins to be the powerhouses that they are now.
People who listen to this podcast, I got to be honest, aren't big fans of most, if not all of that list. And the reason is because, I just want to say this though. The reason is because that they have in many ways fallen back and are identified solely as a young Chicano man, a young gay man, a young Black woman. And the principles, the veneer of progressivism that made people excited about them to begin with seems to have faded away with their association with Mayor Bloomberg's Mayor Camp and a lot of these institutions that have them out there in the world as a kind of younger, diverse troupe of neoliberals. And so I'm curious about you. I mean, you're someone who, I had a lot of fondness for and affinity for, and appreciated your robust support of Bernie Sanders, especially back in 2016 when people weren't doing that. And I was really looking forward to your run at your gubernatorial run. But it did seem to me that you weren't really running so much as a Bernie bro. And I understand that it's Maryland and I understand that it's a different kind of environment. But I was covering 2018 races at the Intercept at the time. And I remember rooting for you, but also feeling like the left energy that might have been behind the campaign, and maybe you didn't feel like it was needed, wasn't going to be galvanized by the way in which the campaign was manifesting. And I wonder what you make of why you ultimately lost in that effort. And I also was curious whether you had any insights from that run about what just went down in Virginia.
I mean, we were the only campaign in the country that ran for state-based Medicare for all. Which is like a massive idea if you actually try.
Wait a minute, didn't Home Slice in Michigan, who also lost, whose name I'm now blocking?
Oh,
Al Said.
Was he state or federal?
It was state. There was a Michigan state. Yeah, because what's her name who went to work for the Warren campaign?
That would make sense. He was my fellow Bernie bro, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say that we did run a very Bernie bro campaign, because what that means is that you go kick the beehive of the entire pharmaceutical lobby, the beehive of the whole for-profit medicine machine. I think if you ask, we also ran, on harm reduction. We ran on, a whole bunch of kind of like hardcore harm reduction. We ran on ending mass incarceration and using the savings to fund our public universities. We ran on free community college. I mean, I think if you go right down the line, it couldn't have been, more of an extension of the campaign. Now, of the presidential that had just happened, of the Bernie campaign. What it came down to in the end was that 75% of the voters in Maryland knew who I was, and 100% knew who the sitting governor was. And that is a function of your advertising budget at the very end.
Lefties are willing to get to some campaigns. I don't know if you remember, but Bernie Sanders raised more money in this last presidential race than anybody else.
Sure.
Race,
I mean, Bernie raised us. We raised, I had more donors than like anybody, ever who would run as a Democrat in Maryland. We had a lower average campaign, average donation. And yet, Maryland doesn't excite people. It's not like, like from around the country. It's just like a regular state. They think of it as being kind of a blue state. We would focus group folks trying to figure out how to, build it. But the bottom line is that I would say we fell about $10 million short from an advertising perspective of what we needed to penetrate the bottom 25%. What we knew, and you can go back and you can look at the Republican, and I kind of go into this detail, how anybody's thinking about running, is that the Republican was afraid of our message because he kept putting out these kind of like soft pedal versions. So I would say, like, I'm for free community college. And then the governor would announce like his own spin on free community college. Or, I would say, I'm for 20% raise for teachers. And then the governor would run an ad saying, I'm for higher salaries for teachers too. And he was talking about a 1% COLA. But he would never try to give anybody a reason to figure out who the other guy was in his advertising. And what we knew is that for every 100 voters in that final stretch who learned of our campaign, we won 55 of them to 45. But we did not have the dollars in the final stretch to get to 100% name ID. Generally, in the gubernatorial race, if you can get to 75%, you're where you need to be. But when you're up against a popular incumbent, it's just a different kettle of fish.
We could have a whole conversation about what happened to Maryland and the lessons learned. I mean, I am curious what your take is on McAuliffe's loss.
I mean, right away, what you saw in Virginia was there was just not much enthusiasm for a former governor running for governor again. They have a one-term limit in Virginia. And right away, when he announced, he was trailing Biden by like 10 points in his
why
state.
would the Democratic Party do that? If that was obviously true from the get-go, why would the Democratic Party set itself up like that?
You know, we supported Ms. Foy, People for the American Way. We were all behind Ms. Foy, who young Black woman, state legislator, I think first Black female grad of the Virginia Military Institute, progressive, endorsed by the unions and our revolution and all of that. And she would have brought a lot more energy. Absolutely. But the big money in the primary, the same money that, for instance, had supported Martin O'Malley, but wouldn't support me, here in the state. The developers who I, generally, characterize as corrupt, because they are in Maryland, weren't trying to write me checks. That class of donor lined up behind Terry because he was good for business for them, and that's just a rational decision that business people make. I get it. I didn't benefit from it because we ran such a progressive campaign, because we were so focused on actually opening up government to everybody in the state and getting beyond old patterns of nepotism and corruption. And Ms. Foy ran into a similar thing, but she couldn't even get out of the primary. Now, if we had had a young Black woman running, enthusiasm would have been much higher. And if you,
I would say if you had a young Black progressive woman with a good populist policy base running, it would generate enthusiasm.
Yeah, and she was all of that. She was all of that. And yet they've got to have the money, at the end of the day, to like reach the voters who aren't reading the paper, aren't watching the news, are kind of unplugged, focused on their own lives. And again, what we found is that's about a quarter of the electorate in Maryland. And to get to them takes a whole lot of money. And Youngkin, money was never an obstacle for Youngkin. He's a very rich man who was willing to pour his resources into it in a very aggressive way, and ran an insurgent campaign that was well funded. And so that at the end of the day, I mean, trust me, I had words with the Democratic Governors Association, and I'll tell you, Briahna, the point that the establishment, if the establishment's really going to regret not investing in my race because they didn't want a progressive to be governor, it's going to be when Larry Hogan challenges Chris Van Hollen, which looks like it's about to happen. And right now, he would beat Chris Van Hollen by more than 20 points from the polls that we're seeing. You can just look at the Goucher poll that came out. And that's what I told them back then. I was like, I get it. I get you don't want to support a progressive to take out this sitting governor. You guys kind of like doing business to him. Understand he intends to be president. Understand he will take out one of our senators to get there. And right now, we are looking like we could be in for the most expensive Senate race in this next term here in Maryland. Nobody's even talking about it. But if you just go look at the polls in the state, you'll see why, and you look at Hogan's ambitions, why it almost seems like a foregone conclusion that he's going to declare. He doesn't have to declare early because he has a big war chest. He can just come right in, and he would start out with like a 20 to 25 point advantage over the Democratic income.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.